The sky above northern France was a frozen canvas of steel and silence. It was February 1944, and the contrails of war stretched from horizon to horizon. At 20,000 feet, a formation of Messerschmitt Bf-109s cut through the cold air, their pilots confident, voices relaxed over the radio. They had ruled these skies for years. Below them, another shape appeared, sleek, unfamiliar, with wings that seemed too long, too elegant for a fighter. Laughter broke over the German frequencies. Amerikanische Spielzeuge, one said. American toys. The unknown aircraft banked into the sun, climbing higher with impossible grace. Then it turned, fast, deliberate, predatory. Tracer fire flashed across the empty blue, and the laughter stopped. The P-51 Mustang dropped from the heavens with the speed of a falling blade, its 6 Browning machine guns tearing through the air like a storm of metal. One Messerschmitt burst into flame, spiraling into the gray clouds below. The others scattered, climbing desperately, but the new American fighter stayed with them, faster, higher, relentless. In those few minutes of confusion, the balance of air power over Europe began to shift. The hunters of the Reich had met their match, and for the first time, German pilots realized the sky no longer belonged to them. In the early years of the Second World War, the Luftwaffe was the pride of Germany's military machine. Its pilots were young, disciplined, and deadly. Their aircraft, the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190, represented the cutting edge of aviation engineering. Between 1939 and 1941, German squadrons dominated the skies over Europe, from the Polish plains to the French countryside. When the Battle of Britain began in the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe expected another swift victory. Instead, they met a resilient and organized Royal Air Force. Still, even after that setback, German pilots maintained an air of superiority. They saw themselves as heirs to a new era of aerial warfare, the natural masters of the sky. By 1942, however, cracks began to show. The Luftwaffe had spread itself thin, fighting over North Africa, the Mediterranean, and deep into Soviet territory. Allied air power was growing, not only in number but in coordination. American factories, untouched by bombing and fueled by industrial might, were producing aircraft at a pace that no Axis nation could match. The United States Army Air Forces, relatively untested in 1941, were now filling the skies with B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators. These bombers were the backbone of the American strategy. Daylight precision bombing aimed at crippling Germany's war production, but daylight bombing came with a deadly price. Without long-range escort fighters, bombers flying deep into German territory were vulnerable. The Luftwaffe exploited that weakness mercilessly. From 1942 through early 1943, entire bomber formations were shredded before they reached their targets. The missions over Schweinfurt and Regensburg in August 1943 became tragic lessons. Hundreds of men lost, dozens of aircraft turned to burning debris before ever releasing a bomb. American pilots called it flying into the meat grinder. The brass knew something had to change. The problem was range. Allied fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the early P-38 Lightning could protect bombers partway across occupied Europe, but they couldn't reach Germany's industrial heartland. When the fighters turned back for fuel, the Luftwaffe attacked with full force. German aces like Adolf Galland and Egon Mayer boasted that once the escorts disappeared, the sky belonged to them again. For the air war to be won, the Allies needed a fighter that could go the entire distance, from England to Berlin and back, while matching or exceeding German aircraft in performance. In 1940, before America had even entered the war, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation with a request: build more Curtiss P-40 Warhawks for the Royal Air Force. But North America's president, Dutch Kindleberger, had a different idea. Instead of producing an outdated model, he proposed designing a completely new fighter, one that would outperform the P-40 and cost no more time to produce. The result was the NA-73X, the prototype that would evolve into the Mustang. When the first Mustangs entered service with the Royal Air Force in 1942, they were sleek, fast, and maneuverable, but not great at high altitude. Their Allison V1710 engines lost power above 15,000 feet, making them ill-suited for bomber escort duties. The British, however, saw potential. In 1943, they made a crucial decision: Replace the Allison engine with the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the same power plant that drove the Spitfire 9. The transformation was astonishing. Suddenly, the Mustang could reach speeds of over 430 miles per hour and climb to altitudes above 40,000 feet. Its range exceeded 1,500 miles with drop tanks. It could dive faster, climb higher, and maneuver as sharply as anything in the sky. By late 1943, American engineers and the U.S. Army Air Forces were convinced. The new P-51 Mustang would become the long-range escort the bombers desperately needed. When the first units arrived in Europe, they were met with cautious optimism. Many bomber crews had heard promises before. New planes, new tactics, only to see them fail under German fire. But the Mustang was different. Its first real test came in December 1943, escorting bombers to targets over Bremen and Kiel. The results were immediate. German fighters that rose to intercept found themselves hunted instead. The Mustang could chase down a Bf-109 in level flight, dive faster than a Focke-Wulf, and still have enough fuel to pursue retreating enemies all the way home. The Luftwaffe pilots who encountered it often mistook it for a variant of the British Spitfire, until they saw it keep climbing, faster and longer than anything else. Still, among the ranks of German pilots there was disbelief. Reports of an American plane with such range and performance were dismissed as exaggerations or propaganda. Luftwaffe intelligence initially underestimated the threat, assuming the P-51's performance was temporary or dependent on Allied numerical superiority. But word spread quickly through squadron briefings and pilot chatter. Those who faced it firsthand began to call it der lange Schwanzteufel, the long-tailed devil. The arrival of the Mustang marked more than just a new chapter in technology. It changed the psychology of the air war. For years, German pilots had been hunters. They stalked bombers with near impunity, confident that their aircraft were faster, stronger, and better built. Now they were the hunted. The P-51s could appear suddenly, high above the contrails, diving through the sunlight, guns blazing. For the first time, Allied bombers flew to Berlin and back with fighter escort the entire way. By early 1944, the impact was undeniable. The Luftwaffe was bleeding fuel, pilots, and morale. Every mission they flew became a gamble. The once invincible Messerschmitt squadrons were forced to face an enemy that could match them in every measure and surpass them in endurance. What had begun as laughter over the radio would soon turn to silence, and broken only by the crackle of distress calls and the echo of engines fading into the cold winter air. And as the spring of 1944 approached, the war in the sky would reach a decisive moment, a contest of speed, endurance, and will that would determine the fate of air superiority over Europe. The P-51 Mustang was more than a machine. It was an idea made real, the culmination of lessons learned from years of brutal trial and error in the skies over Europe. Its sleek fuselage and laminar flow wing design gave it an edge in aerodynamics never before achieved in a mass-produced fighter. Every curve of the aircraft had purpose. Every inch of its frame was engineered for endurance and speed. Yet what truly made it revolutionary was not its shape, but its heart. The British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine built under license in the United States by Packard. That combination transformed an average airframe into the finest piston engine fighter of the war. For the German pilots who had grown used to dominating every encounter, this new arrival seemed at first inconsequential. Many Luftwaffe veterans still carried the arrogance earned during their golden years, from the campaigns over France and the Mediterranean to the skies of Russia. The Bf-109 and the FW-190 were considered legends, both nimble and deadly, backed by years of combat refinement. The Luftwaffe's elite believed their training and their aircraft were unmatched. When intelligence reports mentioned a new American fighter entering service, most laughed it off. To them, the Americans had always been heavy-handed engineers, good at building bombers, tanks, and trucks, but clumsy when it came to fighters. They could not imagine that an aircraft made across the Atlantic, flown by pilots with barely 2 years of combat experience, could rival the machines of Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf, but arrogance has a way of blinding men to change. The P-51's first significant encounters with German fighters revealed a shift in the nature of the air war. The Mustang could escort bombers from takeoff in England all the way to Berlin and back, a round trip of over 1,600 kilometers. German interceptors designed for short, high-intensity engagements couldn't match that endurance. Luftwaffe commanders quickly realized they could no longer rely on predictable windows of vulnerability in the Allied bombing raids. Before the Mustang, German fighters would strike bombers once the Allied escorts turned home due to limited fuel. Now there was no such window. American fighters stayed with the bombers for the entire mission, waiting above or behind in silent formation, ready to pounce. The first pilots to encounter them came back shaken. Reports told of American fighters appearing out of the sun, diving with incredible precision, then climbing again before any counterattack could form. One Luftwaffe officer compared it to being stalked by a machine that never tired. The Mustangs could cover entire formations, disrupt German coordination, and still engage multiple opponents before refueling. Their drop tanks gave them freedom that no German pilot had experienced. Technically, the P-51's advantages were profound. It carried 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, capable of delivering concentrated fire with high velocity and range. Its ceiling was higher than that of the FW-190, its roll rate nearly equal, and its speed superior at almost every altitude. Its efficient aerodynamics allowed it to cruise with minimal drag, conserving precious fuel. Pilots described the controls as silky, a balance of power and finesse. Unlike the heavier P-47 Thunderbolt, the Mustang was light and responsive, perfect for dogfights. Yet it was its range that transformed strategy. It turned the air war from a series of raids into a continuous, unbroken offensive. On the other side, the German Messerschmitt Bf-109, once the apex predator of the air, was beginning to show its age. Originally designed in the mid-1930s, it had evolved through dozens of variants, but its small airframe limited the upgrades engineers could make. The powerful Daimler-Benz engines gave it excellent climb and acceleration, yet its short wings and narrow landing gear made it dangerous to handle. It was unforgiving at low speeds and prone to ground accidents. Still, the Luftwaffe had no alternative in sufficient numbers. The FW-190 offered better performance at medium altitude, but production couldn't keep up with attrition. By 1944, Germany was running out of everything: fuel, pilots, and time. Allied bombers targeted synthetic oil plants, crippling aviation logistics. Meanwhile, the United States was producing Mustangs by the thousands. Every week, new squadrons arrived in England, filling the airfields of East Anglia. When the 4th Fighter Group and the 357th Fighter Group transitioned to the P-51, the effect was immediate. American pilots who had struggled to reach their bomber formations in older planes could now fly side by side with them from takeoff to landing. For the Luftwaffe, this was a nightmare. The Mustang didn't just guard the bombers, it hunted the hunters. American doctrine shifted from defensive escort to offensive sweeps. P-51s began prowling ahead of bomber formations, clearing the skies before the German interceptors even took off. They strafed airfields, destroyed aircraft on the ground, and shot down any fighter that tried to climb. Suddenly, the Reich's once proud Jagdgeschwader, its fighter wings, were fighting on the defensive even before the first bombs fell. The psychological effect was devastating. Luftwaffe pilots who had once mocked their American counterparts now faced them with dread. German ace Walter Schuck recalled his shock the first time he tried to outrun a P-51 in his Bf-109G. "It was impossible," he said years later. "They followed me up, they followed me down. No escape." Others spoke of the unnerving sound of the Mustang's engines, deep, confident, relentless. It was unlike the sharp whine of German engines. It carried the tone of something inevitable. For American pilots, the Mustang became a symbol of survival and purpose. Men who had once watched their bomber crews slaughtered over Schweinfurt now returned home with most of their comrades alive. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Howard earned the Medal of Honor after single-handedly defending a bomber formation against dozens of enemy fighters, shooting down multiple attackers and forcing the rest to retreat. His actions became legendary, not only for courage but as proof of what the P-51 could do. Still, victory in the air was never bloodless. The German pilots who fought back did so with ferocity. Many were veterans of hundreds of missions, and even as their numbers thinned, their skill remained formidable. The Mustang might have been faster, but the Luftwaffe pilots had experience honed by years of war. They used cloud cover, sun angles, and ambush tactics to compensate for their disadvantages. The skies over Germany became deadly arenas of attrition, where even a single mistake could mean death. Every engagement told the same story. German pilots tried to dictate the fight through altitude and surprise, while the P-51s answered with range and resilience. Once a Mustang locked onto a target, few could shake it. German pilots learned to identify the plane by its distinct silhouette, a long fuselage, a bubble canopy, and that unmistakable tail. The very sight of it began to erode morale. By the spring of 1944, Luftwaffe Command admitted the truth privately. The balance had shifted irrevocably. Even the introduction of new aircraft like the Me-262 jet and the Tu-152 came too late, produced in small numbers and flown by inexperienced recruits. The Allies now had complete control over the skies of Western Europe. And the instrument of that dominance more than any other machine was the P-51 Mustang. In mess halls and airstrips across occupied Europe, captured German pilots spoke of disbelief. Some still insisted that the Americans had cheated, that the Mustang's performance was exaggerated or artificially boosted. But others more sober simply called it what it was, a masterpiece. We knew when we saw it, one said later, that the days of the Luftwaffe were over. As the war neared its turning point, that realization became undeniable. The laughter that had once filled the radio channels before every sortie was gone. In its place were curt commands, nervous breathing, and the heavy silence of men who understood that the age of German dominance in the air had come to an end. And yet the decisive proof of that transformation, the true moment when disbelief turned to despair, was still to come. The winter of 1944 was bitter and gray over Germany. The air war had reached a fever pitch. What began as a contest of technology had now become a test of endurance, of who could still fight when the skies themselves seemed exhausted. Allied bombers filled the heavens daily, casting vast shadows over the frozen countryside. Below them, Luftwaffe airfields were battered, their runways cratered, their fuel depots burned out. Yet from the remaining strips of concrete and grass, German fighters still clawed into the air, small formations of Bf-109s and Fw-190s, rising like sparks into a storm. The first mission of that year's decisive campaign began on February 20th, 1944. The Allies called it Big Week. It was an all-out assault on the heart of the German aircraft industry, factories at Leipzig, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Augsburg. The logic was brutal but simple. Destroy the Luftwaffe where it was born. The bombers would hit the production lines, the P-51 Mustangs would hunt the defenders. The goal was not merely to destroy planes, but to destroy the very ability to build them. When the first formations approached Germany's industrial belt, Luftwaffe radar stations came alive. Sirens wailed across airfields from Hanover to Munich. Within minutes, German pilots were running to their cockpits, boots slipping on ice, engines roaring in protest of the cold. They knew what was coming. Hundreds of bombers escorted by hundreds more fighters. Among them, the Mustangs waited high above the formations, invisible in the sunlight. As the first engagements erupted near Braunschweig, German pilots tried their usual tactics: frontal assaults through the bomber stream, quick bursts of fire, and a breakaway dive. It was a dangerous but proven method, but now, before they could even reach the bombers, silver shapes appeared in their path. P-51 swooped down from altitude, scattering the German formations before they could organize. The sky became chaos, contrails twisting, wings breaking, fire trailing through the clouds. Captain Clarence Bud Anderson of the 357th Fighter Group recalled seeing German fighters attempting to climb to their attack positions, only to be intercepted before they got there. They were flying straight into our guns, he said. They didn't have a chance. For the first time, the Luftwaffe was losing battles before the bombers were even engaged. By the end of the first day, German aircraft losses were catastrophic. Nearly 150 planes destroyed, with dozens more damaged beyond repair. Worse still, many of those lost were flown by experienced veterans, men who could not be replaced. The Luftwaffe still fought with ferocity, but its aces were dying faster than new pilots could be trained. For every German shot down, 3 or 4 inexperienced replacements were waiting in training schools that now lacked fuel and instructors. The Mustangs pressed their advantage ruthlessly. With each passing day of Big Week, they pushed deeper into Germany, flying low-level sweeps over enemy airfields, strafing parked planes, and destroying anything that moved. At Oschersleben and Gotha, Entire Luftwaffe squadrons were caught on the ground, wiped out in seconds. German airfield crews took to hiding aircraft under camouflage nets, but even that could not stop the relentless hunts. In one haunting scene described by American pilots, a Luftwaffe base erupted in flames as Mustangs raked the runway with gunfire. Mechanics fled for cover, hands raised, while others tried to drag wounded comrades away from burning wreckage. Smoke curled into the cold air, and amid it the charred remains of Messerschmitts lay scattered like broken wings. For the German pilots who did manage to take off, survival became an act of desperation. Fuel shortages forced them to limit engagement time to mere minutes. Even successful dogfights ended with the danger of running dry before reaching base. The P-51s, by contrast, had range to spare. They could chase down retreating fighters all the way to landing approach. Luftwaffe veterans described the humiliation of being attacked even as they lowered their landing gear, unable to escape or fight back. The statistics from Big Week told a grim story. Over 2,600 Allied aircraft sorties, 3,500 tons of bombs dropped, and more than 350 German fighters destroyed in less than a week. It marked the breaking point of the Luftwaffe's ability to defend the Reich. Yet beyond numbers, there was something deeper, a shift in perception. In the following months, P-51 squadrons became a symbol of Allied dominance. They flew in perfect formation above the bombers, sleek and steady, their pilots scanning the horizon for movement. German reconnaissance photos began to show an eerie pattern. Skies filled with contrails extending from Britain to Berlin, a white web of Allied power stretching across Europe. It was an image of inevitability, of a war that was no longer about who could win the sky, but who could endure its loss. Then came the spring of 1944, the prelude to D-Day. Every flight, every mission was a step toward one goal, clearing the skies for the invasion of Normandy. The Mustangs flew daily sweeps over northern France, destroying rail lines, convoys, and airfields. Luftwaffe attempts to interfere were crushed before they began. In some areas, German ground troops reported that Allied aircraft dominated the air 24 hours a day. On June 6, 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches, P-51s roared overhead, patrolling the skies like hawks. Not a single German fighter successfully broke through to attack the invasion fleet. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was grounded, crippled by fuel shortages, overwork, and relentless Allied air power. But the true turning point for many German pilots came months later, during the defense of the Reich's last desperate offensive, the Ardennes, known to the world as the Battle of the Bulge. It was December 1944, and Germany threw everything it had left into one final gamble. The Luftwaffe too tried to muster a surprise blow. On New Year's Day 1945, they launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive low-level attack against Allied airfields in Western Europe. It was meant to cripple Allied air power before the offensive failed. At dawn, hundreds of German fighters took off, skimming the treetops, hoping to catch their enemies off guard. For a few brief moments it worked. Allied planes burned on runways from Belgium to the Netherlands. But the victory was short-lived. Within hours, waves of P-51s and other Allied fighters counterattacked. The Germans had lost their element of surprise, and with it their last real chance. By the end of that day, nearly 300 Luftwaffe aircraft were gone, along with irreplaceable pilots. It was, in effect, the end of the German Air Force. For those who survived, the realization was unbearable. Veteran pilot Franz Stiegler described the silence in his base that evening. "No one spoke," he said. "We all knew it was finished. We were ghosts still flying." From then on, the P-51s roamed the skies unchallenged. They hunted trains, convoys, even columns of retreating soldiers. The war that had once seemed a contest between equals had become a slow, inevitable march toward collapse. German pilots who had once laughed at the American fighter now faced it with fear, not only for their lives but for the loss of their pride. In one recorded account from early 1945, a downed Luftwaffe officer reportedly asked his American captors to see the inside of a Mustang cockpit. When he climbed in, he sat silently for several minutes, running his hands over the controls. "It feels alive," he murmured. "We thought you built machines, but you built something that thinks." By the war's final months, the P-51 Mustang had escorted bombers over Berlin, crippled the German fuel supply, and decimated what remained of the Luftwaffe's fighting strength. Its pilots became legends, calm, skilled, and deadly. And for every German ace that fell, another young recruit took his place, terrified, barely trained, and flying into a sky where death came without warning. What had begun as laughter in 1943 had become silence by 1945. The Messerschmitts that once ruled the air were now burning wrecks scattered across airfields and forests. And high above them, the Mustang's long wings gleamed in the sunlight, a symbol of a new order, one that had taken flight on the strength of ingenuity, courage, and relentless will. By the spring of 1945, the skies over Europe were no longer battlefields. They were corridors of inevitability. Every contrail that streaked across the pale horizon belonged to the Allies. The Luftwaffe, once the vanguard of German military pride, had been reduced to fragments, scattered, starving, and desperate. What the P-51 Mustang had accomplished went beyond victory in dogfights. It had systematically dismantled the German air war from the inside out. It wasn't just about air superiority, it was about dominance, psychological and logistical. Factories lay in ruins. Training schools were silent. Runways were littered with twisted wreckage, engines half buried in mud. Every part of the Luftwaffe's intricate system had depended on a steady flow of fuel, replacement parts, and pilots. The Mustang had cut all three. Allied bombers, now free to strike deep inside the Reich, obliterated oil refineries at Leuna, Pölitz, and Blechhammer. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe was grounded, not by enemy guns but by starvation. Even the most advanced aircraft designs of the Me-262 jet, the Ta-152 high-altitude interceptor, became little more than engineering marvels sitting idle on runways. The Mustang had helped make that possible. By escorting bombers safely to their targets, it had ensured that each raid landed its blow. The Americans had finally achieved what the Luftwaffe had dreamed of in 1940, strategic air supremacy over an entire continent. But the aftermath was not just measured in tonnage destroyed or aircraft downed. It was written on faces, weary, hollow, and resigned. German pilots who had once soared over France with confidence now walked through ruined airfields staring at rows of burnt-out Messerschmitts. Many of them were barely 20 years old. They had trained in a rush under constant bombing, with instructors who sometimes had to borrow fuel from farm trucks just to keep lessons running. Their first missions were often their last. Veterans like Adolf Galland and Johannes Steinhoff, the elite few who had survived since the early days, knew the end had come. They had fought in an air force that was once the envy of the world. Now they flew with boys who had never even fired at a live target before their first sortie. Galland would later describe it bluntly. "We were finished long before we admitted it." The P-51 and the fuel bombs did that. Allied intelligence reports confirmed what the skies made obvious. By early 1945, Germany's aircraft losses were beyond recovery. In January alone, the Luftwaffe lost over 1,000 aircraft, a number that could no longer be replaced. The Allies, on the other hand, were producing thousands of new fighters every month. By April, there were over 14,000 Allied aircraft operating in Europe, and they owned the day. The sight of the P-51 became as familiar to German civilians as the sound of air raid sirens. Farmers in Bavaria and Saxony watched in silence as long streams of silver fighters passed overhead, escorting bomber armadas that filled the sky. The once proud hunters of the Reich were now hunted from above, and everyone on the ground knew it. Prisoners of war later spoke of the strange, conflicting emotions they felt toward the Mustang. To the soldiers and civilians who saw it streak across the horizon, it represented destruction, yet also beauty. Its lines were pure, its presence unmistakable. Even German engineers admired its design, admitting it was the perfect combination of form and function. In Allied airfields across France and England, the pilots of those same Mustangs were acutely aware of the price of that beauty. Every mission carried danger. Flak batteries still claimed lives. Weather, mechanical failure, or a lucky shot could turn victory into tragedy in seconds. The Mustang had given them reach, not immunity, but they flew on day after day knowing that their work had shifted the war's balance completely. The bomber crews they protected now completed missions that once had seemed suicidal. Loss rates dropped dramatically. In 1943, American bomber losses had reached almost 30% on deep raids. By mid-1944, With P-51 escort, those losses fell to less than 5%. That change wasn't just tactical, and it was transformational. It meant the Allies could sustain a relentless tempo of attacks without breaking morale or manpower. The war's final months were filled with these contrasts, tragedy and triumph intertwined. Over Berlin, shattered remnants of the Luftwaffe still tried to rise. Mi-262 jets streaked past bomber formations, but their fuel-starved engines sputtered and failed. W-190 scrambled from hidden forest strips, only to be shot down moments later by circling P-51s. It was not combat, it was survival, and even that was slipping away. By April 1945, the Mustang had escorted bombers all the way to the capital of the Third Reich. Photographs from that time show contrails over Berlin, long white scars across the sky, as if history itself were writing the final lines of a chapter. Beneath those lines, the city burned. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as a fighting force. Its once feared emblem, the Black Cross, now marked wreckage scattered across Europe. The air war had ended not with a climactic final battle, but with exhaustion. In the days that followed, Allied soldiers moved through captured airfields filled with hundreds of destroyed or abandoned German aircraft. Among them, P-51 pilots sometimes walked silently, observing the remnants of the enemy they had fought for years. They saw the wrecks of Bf-109s that had once seemed unstoppable, now covered in frost and silence. Some found letters in cockpits, half-written notes, family photos, reminders that their enemies had been young men like themselves. There was little triumph in that realization, only reflection. For the German prisoners, the Mustang represented something they could not comprehend at first, an aircraft that embodied not just power but endurance. Many of them had believed that American technology was crude, mass-produced, lacking the finesse of German engineering. But the war had shown otherwise. The Mustang was precision married to practicality, performance joined with production. It symbolized the industrial will of a nation that could outthink, outbuild, and outlast its enemy. The aftermath of the air war left lessons that would shape aviation for decades. The P-51 proved that range was as vital as speed, that strategy could be redefined by endurance. It demonstrated that control of the skies could dictate the outcome of wars on the ground. And it marked the beginning of an era where pilots, once knights of the air, became instruments of a larger machine and part of a vast, coordinated system of warfare. The Luftwaffe's fall was not the failure of its pilots, many of whom fought with extraordinary courage. It was the collapse of an entire doctrine, one that had failed to evolve. The Mustang had simply arrived at the right moment, combining every hard-earned lesson of the war into one near-perfect form. For the Allies, it became a symbol of liberation. For the Germans, a symbol of defeat. But for both, it became a legend. The aircraft that changed the meaning of air power forever. And as Europe's skies cleared in the months after the war, the last Mustangs flew over ruined cities not as hunters but as guardians. Their engines echoed through valleys once filled with fear. Onlookers watched them pass, sleek, silent, and steady. Reminders of a time when the fate of nations had been decided far above the clouds. The P-51 Mustang was more than a fighter. It was the embodiment of transformation. It turned the air war from a contest of speed and skill into a demonstration of endurance, precision, and willpower. Its legacy went far beyond the wreckage of Luftwaffe airfields or the statistics of missions flown. It changed how humanity understood air dominance itself. For the German pilots who survived, the Mustang became a haunting memory, a symbol of the shift from pride to humility. They had once believed that engineering genius alone could guarantee supremacy. The war proved otherwise. The Mustang was not born from arrogance or myth. It was born from necessity, from collaboration, adaptation, and the quiet brilliance of engineers who refused to accept limitations. For the Allies, it became a promise fulfilled. It meant that their bombers could strike deep and return home. It meant that the skies over Europe, once ruled by fear, could finally belong to freedom. Every mission it flew was a bridge, connecting courage to strategy, machine to man, purpose to victory. When the war ended, the Mustang's silhouette lingered in the collective memory of both sides. It represented the closing of an era, the last great piston engine fighter before the jet age began. But it also represented something more human. The power of innovation driven by survival, the ability to learn faster than the enemy, and the belief that mastery was not about perfection but persistence. In the end, the laughter that had once greeted its arrival turned into silence, a silence filled with respect. The German pilots who had mocked it, the engineers who had doubted it, the world that had underestimated it, all came to see what it truly was. A machine that changed the course of a war, a symbol of a generation's endurance, a reminder that even in the darkest years of destruction, human ingenuity could still create something extraordinary, something that soared,